Well, white's king position is perfectly secure. The queens are off. There's no danger of getting mated. The black pieces are passive. So why not gradually improve your position? And now another very characteristic manoeuvre in this game. Knight d2. If there is an Achilles heel in the black pawn formation, it must be that pawn on b7. And so white's idea behind knight d2 is knight to b3 and then knight to a5. And this is a very awkward idea to meet, because there's no easy way to defend that pawn on b7. So very cleverly, Kovacevic is juggling with the moves here. And move by move, he's gradually improving his position. Whereas black, once again, is being forced into a position of defender, only defending. And as we've said, this is more or less a game-losing plan. I mean, just look at those miserable moves. Don't forget, at the time this game was played, Robert Byrne was one of the best players in the United States. He'd fought for the quarterfinals of the Candidates Tournament against Boris Spassky, one of the world's best players in effect. He's being forced into these miserable moves. And now another interesting move by white, pawn to f3. This really is a model demonstration of how to play these positions with white. And now what, of course, black has to do is somehow to get the move e5 in. I mean, this is the only way black is ever going to get any counterplay in this position. Other than that, it's a pretty miserable defensive task. You're just waiting for white to break through. Byrne's next move is pretty abject, but what do you suggest? It's very difficult to defend against white's idea of sacrifices on c6 or b7 in this position. So rook e8 and bishop f8 was obviously judged as too slow. Byrne goes on to full defence. King d2. Unhurriedly, white strengthens his position. He sees there's no way for black to prevent the sacrifice on the queen side that's coming up. So he gradually makes his position better and better. b6. That was the point of rook c8. It wasn't just a passive rook move. Black must try to do something. Bishop takes a6. A beautiful move. Eventually that move had to come. Either that or some sort of sacrifice on b7, followed by bishop takes a6. Rook takes a6, and now knight takes c6. Breaking through on what looked like an impregnable black queenside position. Well, there's no move. I mean, if rook takes a1, knight takes e7, check. So rook takes c6, rook takes a6. Black more or less has to go back. Rook ha1. B takes c5, a nice little intermezzo there, rook a8, rook f8, and now b takes c5, with a winning position for white. Simply because the rooks are coming off, and then it's very easy to understand that these pawns are just going to come all the way down the board. Black has no counterplay against the king, and Kovacevic went on to win this game. But this is an example which you have to look at time and again, in my view, because it demonstrates perfect piece placement by white and the execution of a well-conceived plan. Going back now to Chernyshov versus Tomczak. White chooses knight bd2. And after having seen that previous very impressive example, you might wonder, well, why should white ever choose this move when he can go c4, knight c3? Well, Chernyshov shows that there's more than one string to white's bow here, because again he goes through with the move c4, and queen comes out to b3, queen to b6. It's remarkably similar to the last game, except that in this case white is able to get his knight on b3 much more quickly, leaving the knight on f3 for active operations. I mean, maybe that knight will come into e5 at some point. It's an interesting way of tinkering with the move order. Well, rook fc8 was played by Tomczak, knight a5, and suddenly black's in trouble. All due to this characteristic idea. And in fact, I'm not actually sure what practical advice I could offer to black against this plan, other than not to go in for this type of setup in the first place. White delays c4 to a propitious moment, then he manoeuvres his knight to a5. He seems to be able to drum up a very big advantage without too much effort. And certainly after knight a5, once again we see that black has serious problems defending b7. So b6, And now Chernyshov finds another way of sacrificing a piece there with bishop a6. Interesting, this one, slightly different to last time. Very important indeed that black can't use the square b8 for his rook in this position. Because, well, if he could do so, he'd be creating pressure and counterplay against b4. But without that trump, then a7's under fire. The whole position seems to be collapsing. Once again, white is able to play very, very comfortable moves in order to get the advantage. Swinging his rook over there, doubling up. Knight comes into e4, trying to create some play. But black saw nothing better than just knight ef6. Okay, well, all the time in the world now. Bit of confusing play by black, but it will come to the same in the end. White doubles rooks. White has infiltrated on the queen side. Well, bishop h8. A terrible move to have to play, but what else? And now a very good period of play where white renounces the opportunity to play rook takes d7. He could play rook takes d7, but after that black will get his rook active on a8, and no way is white going to allow that. The essence of white's advantage really is that the knight on d7 and the bishop h8 aren't really playing in this game. He's just continuing to build up, and he will take on d7 at his leisure. For the time being, he just snuffs out any possible black counterplay whatsoever. Bishop c4, I'm running out of things to do. I mean, how would you feel if you were in black's position? That's really what I would ask you here, ask you to consider. I think basically Tom Chack is getting very frustrated. He's got very little to do. He just plays bishop c4 out of inertia. He really can't think what to do. Nothing moves. And now an excellent move. b3. The tactics occur from a superior position. It's classic chess strategy. And now bishop b5. Well, we should of course see what happens after bishop takes b3. I mean, that is very important. After that, I'm pretty sure white would have crashed through with b5. That's the main idea. Again, it's a question of timing. Knight comes back to f8. I'm pretty sure white can take on f7 with his rook in this position, but a much stronger move is knight e5. Just bringing every piece in. The kitchen sink is being thrown in against the king. Well, really, there's no defence. And now just takes on f8 wins as far as I can see. With two lines, if black takes with a rook, just knight takes f7 is very strong, threatening knight takes h6 checkmate. Rook takes, knight e8, c7. That's the simplest win in the world. And just going back now to the position after bishop takes f8. If king takes f8 by black, well then I think knight takes f7 again. Stronger than rook takes f7, though that probably wins too. Rook takes c6, rook b8. It really is very simple, and now just take on h8 with a decisive material advantage on top of everything else. So going back to the position after b3 now. That's why bishop b5 was played. Rook c7. If black had only a few moves before, he's got even less moves now that he can't use a c4 square. He's really running out of time and position. Knight comes into e5, exposing f7. f7 goes. Bishop must go back to that terrible square. And now, once again, white has all the time in the world to craft a breakthrough. It was essential throughout this game that black was not able to activate his rook. That's the main idea. Note that rook on a7. Solid as a rook, preventing black's rook from coming into the game. So now, you know, f4. I mean, it really is game over. Black can do nothing. And now rook f6. I mean, that's not a move that would occur to everybody at first sight. But we're coming to that type of position where white's got to find the winning idea. Well, the knight on c3 and the bishop on b5 aren't playing, so rook f6. And what is black to do? I mean, if he takes on f6, we have the simple variation. E takes f6, threatening f7 check, rook f8, rook g7 check, king h8, bishop takes f8. Utterly convincing. And if bishop d3, as was played in the game, then f5. A breakthrough prepared with the move f4 a couple of moves beforehand. Bishop takes f6, e takes f6. It's exactly the same thing. Black decided to resign. Another excellent demonstration of London's system dynamics. from what looks like a very innocuous position. Now, a lot of the time, black is going to play a flexible setup against your London system, and this may include the move b6, setting up a Queen's Indian formation. Against this, there's no reason why we should deviate from our plan. It's very important in these positions to retain control of the e4 square, and so bishop d3, I would say, is the best square for the king's bishop. I'm going to use the game Papaioannou versus Mastrovasilis from the Greek Team Championship in 2002 to show exactly how white should tackle this type of position. Now, Mastrovasilis has just played bishop e7. He's possibly threatening knight h5 now, so it's time for h3. And we continue with the traditional London setup, all the pieces coming out in apple pie order, and then the formation of this pawn triangle c3, d4, e3, more or less making white's pawn centre impregnable against all of black's counters. Now, in this game, black forces white's hand by playing d5. He need not do so. For instance, black may play d6 in this position, which is slightly more flexible. Against such setups, queen b1 is quite an interesting move. Again, retaining control of e4 and threatening to push the queenside pawns by going b4 and a4. I think by playing in this manner, white can assure himself of at least a slight advantage against this particular setup. Whether the black queen's knight is on c6 or d7, I strongly recommend this way to play for white. However, going back to the game now, we see d5 being played, which enables white to put into practice the usual plan of building up on the king side. He's going to do this by establishing a knight on e5. I think e5 is the key square in such positions. If you can establish a knight in there, it gives you a base from which you can build your kingside attack. Now, rook fe1 was played. Rook e8. I think when white plays rook fe1 as opposed to rook ae1, he's keeping the option open of playing on the queen side too. I mean, it's not out of the question that white may probe the black position by going a4 in a moment. So I think that's why he plays his rook on f1 to e1 for the time being, keeping everything flexible. And also it vacates the f1 square for a knight and enables the dormant knight on d2 to reroute to a more active circuit. And note that the knight can fight for the e5 square along with its colleague on f3 by coming to perhaps g4 and then into e5. As I say, if white can establish an unchallengeable knight on e5 in this type of position, he generally ends up with a pretty strong attack. So this is why black is bringing his own knight round to g6 to try and forestall this possibility. But in the end, no matter how many pieces black puts on e5, white can always outmatch him. And so this is really a key moment in the game. What should black do now? Well, he elects to take on e5 with his knight on c6. I think this is what a lot of players would do. It opens up the bishop on b7. It keeps the knight on g6 for defensive purposes, and it enables the bishop to come to c5. But what it doesn't do, of course, is alter the balance of forces on the black king side, which is actually heavily in favour of white. And now with h4, white sounds the charge. Maybe h5 is coming, and maybe knight g5, stuff like that. Pressure against h7 and f7. So black voluntarily retreats. A scorched earth policy, getting out of the way of white's coming attack. And now, seeing nothing concrete, Papa just centralises his queen's rook. And of course, it's visible to the naked eye that whatever advantage in this position there is must lie with white. And white has full development. He's got active counterplay in the centre with knight d4. He's got chances against the king side. All his pieces are well placed. Meanwhile, black is somewhat passive and faces an uncomfortable defensive task. But queen c8 is a move in the right direction, enabling bishop a6, which in turn exchanges off one of white's potential powerful attackers. Well, of course, white doesn't want his bishop exchanged, so that's why he steps aside with the queen, enabling to keep the bishop against bishop a6. And a6, the bishop on a6 looks impressive, but you know, it's shooting blanks down an empty diagonal there to f1. It really is an unimportant diagonal in the context of the position. Well, rook a7, hoping to defend along the second rank. h5, continuing to build the attack. and now knight to d4. So like before, white was trying to establish a knight on e5. Here he puts his other knight on d4. What does that do? Well, I think it improves the communication in the white camp. It puts the knight on a pretty impressive square, threatening knight c6. And it also helps white to get his rook into the game. I mean, you never know. That rook might come around the corner and suddenly start to assist in a direct king's attack. So many things with one move. Well, black had to defend against knight c6, so rook c7. In comes the queen. And now white brings his knight back to f3, possibly threatening bishop h4, and then bishop f6, who knows? So black decides to stop that once again. The queen inches across to a good position, and now white brings his knight back. Now I think there are serious dangers to black involved in moves such as rook e3 to f3, and maybe even f4 to f5. It often boils down to a question of pawn levers. When you can't open a position using pieces, you use your pawns to help you. And so, once again, we reach a London system scenario where black is very passive. I mean, this guy playing black, he's 24-6, he's a very strong player. He's found himself in an uncomfortable defensive situation against what initially looked like something very innocuous. But white has been able to establish a very strong attacking position. How does he take things on from here? Well, the first step is to continue to improve his position. f4, f5 is the eventual aim, but it's interesting to note how long it takes white actually to effect this plan as the game continues, because black is able actually to fashion a pretty robust defence. Well, just going back, was queen g5 a threat? Maybe it was. So white takes that idea away from black. The bishops come off, and now once again queen g5 rears its ugly head as a defensive move. White plays f4. It's interesting to see how, once again, white has organised the pawn formation to his satisfaction. The bishop on b1 is an absolute giant, and the pawns on e5 and f4 cover important dark squares. Everything's doing its job in this position, and black once again is very, very passive. Okay, well, reinforcements as a prelude to f5 perhaps. Black tries to take the sting out of an impending f5. White is completely unhurried. There's no rush in this position. He can play f5 as and when he pleases. The most important thing is to keep the pressure on black, to keep black guessing. A direct assault, white judges in this position, is not going to win. I'll just keep building. Keep putting the pressure on. Maybe the time control was coming up. It's moved 38. You never know how short black was of time. He's still got to continue to find good moves. Whereas white can build up at his leisure. Maybe white was in time trouble, who knows? It's the usual case that you don't start decisive action when you're in time trouble until you've successfully negotiated the first time control. And here we see move 41, white plays g4, goes into action. Well, as I've stated many times before, f5 is the aim. And there's no way in the long run that black's going to stop it. I mean, he can manoeuvre to his heart's content, but he's just not going to be able to stop that move. And it's interesting to note that as soon as black tries to do something meaningful or tries to lend some sort of weight to the defence against f5, his position goes quickly downhill. I mean, maybe black could have just or should have just waited, because they know if they're just defending, this is a losing game plan. So what you've seen is that black's played g6. Okay, he's improved communication along his second rank. The rook's able to come to the defence. But there we are. White could not be stopped from playing that move. And of course, once it comes, it's completely crunching. f5, opening up the game at the right moment for all the white pieces. Black tries to exchange the queens. White is very happy. Look at that passed pawn on f6, throttling black completely. It's not a simple question of the passed pawn either, because now comes rook h3. The problem with this position from black's point of view is if he goes knight f8, the simple knight f3 is a match winner, and black has no defence to knight takes g5 check, with carnage to follow. So going back to the game now, rook h3, it didn't last much longer. Knight takes f6 was played by a rather desperate black player, and now rook f3. A nice way to finish a very well played game. Well, moving away from the symmetrical systems, we come back to a King's Indian or Grunfeld type setup with the black pieces. And we're going to look at a game now between Pia Kramling, female grandmaster from Sweden, and Jelena Dembo, who's also a female grandmaster from Greece. This was played in the Accentus Ladies Tournament in August 2006. And whereas in earlier games we saw black building up with the move e5, here Dembo plays c5, and it's as well to know what to do against this move, because again this will be a pretty common way for black to play. Just as a small digression, it would be as well to take a quick look at what white should do after b6. In my view, he should try to probe the black queen side by playing a4. This is a sensible approach. And then a5 if allowed. If black plays a6, we can continue with traditional play. I think white has staked out a small advantage here. He's got pressure against the black queen side, whereas black has no corresponding counterplay as of yet. White gets in first, must be slightly better. Just going back to the position after bishop b7, whereas a4 was possible, the immediate c4 is also playable. I mean, white may try to dispense without the move a4, but against that, black has the instructive move knight e4, which I believe could very well equalise the chances. Black opens up the diagonal for the bishop on b7 if white has to trade. Okay, white can play the traditional plans here with b4 or a4 or knight g5 or whatever, but in general the exchange of pieces has helped black. Whereas a4, an early a4 followed by c4 and then a5 doesn't simplify the position so much, and that thus gives black more problems. Coming back to the position after c5, it's interesting to note that Kramling responds with a more restrained approach here. I mean, I think what we need when we take up the London system is not some sort of theoretical rundown on all the latest variations. We need a whole barrage of ideas. And so this is basically what this DVD is trying to provide. Here we see a more restrained approach initially by white with c3. And it would be useful to have both ideas with c4 in your armoury as well as setups with c3. So what is white trying to do here? Well, we will see. Okay, well, so far the pieces are coming out, and now comes one of the key moves, a4. In essence, when white plays with c4, the queenside advance is of the paramount importance, and try to get the move c5 in. When black plays with c5, white's got to change the plan. And so here we see a4 trying to find another way into the black queenside. a6, intending to answer a5 with b5. And now queen b1. I believe I mentioned this move earlier. White is looking forward at some point to play b4. Of course, white's got to be a bit careful in this position because she can't play b4 immediately due to black's idea of knight to d5. And this is a key response. You've got to watch out for that with white, because that exposes the bishop on f4 and the pawn at c3. Particularly if white had played b4, then the pawn at c3 would be unprotected. So queen b1, yes, it does prepare b4, but you've got to be a little bit careful. You've got to time that move properly. So this is why Kramling first removes the bishop from f4 out of the way of black's idea of knight d5. All right, well, both players developing their rooks there. Queen comes to b8. And now pawn up to e4. So that is another interesting move. And you might ask, well, why does white put her rook on d1 in this position as opposed to e1? Well, I think it's kind of a prophylactic move, rook d1. I mean, it's not clarifying white's intentions for one thing. e4 is slightly sharper. But white is looking forward maybe one day to opening up the position with pawn up to e5, which could very well be a threat immediately. Or maybe d takes c5 somewhere. Then the rook on d1 would be well placed in either case. However, black decides to preempt this plan by going e5 and encourages white to block the position. Now, black's point is that now she wants to launch a typical kingside attack by playing f5. But again, black's got to be very, very careful in this position how she times her pawn levers. If she plays f5 immediately, she runs straight into the move knight g5. And certainly black has to avoid this idea with twin threats of knight e6 or bishop takes h5. So going back to the game, that's why Dembo plays knight f4 and Cramling in turn the safe bishop f1. Well, what we're seeing now is a bit of manoeuvring. White is limbering up to play b4 and black certainly has to play f5. If she doesn't find the right moment to play f5, then black is going to be eternally passive in this position. Of course, black has to jump through hoops of fire in order to get that move in, and bishop c8 and knight b8 are not, I would say, overly impressive. Rook a2 was interesting, the point being that after b4, the rook suddenly comes into play, and it could be useful, you never know, defending f2. So a deep move, rook a2, I would say, by white. Well, now comes a strange move. Pawn up to c4, which white just snaps off. Strange looking move. A decoy. Dembo's deliberately sacrificing a pawn just to decoy the knight away from e3 so that f5 has more impact. Perhaps it was possible to play f5 straight away. Why did Dembo reject that natural move? Well, I think she rejected it because white can open the position by playing b takes c5. And if queen takes c5, white continues to open. The point is, white is thinking that she's got better development, better prospects for her pieces, so opening up the game is logical. And if bishop takes f5, knight takes, rook takes, bishop takes f4, I think if black had captured with a pawn on f5, white would have certainly snapped that knight off very quickly indeed, completely laming black's pawn formation. Rook takes f4, and now the knight comes to g5 with a clear advantage. Just going back to the point at which white played rook takes f4, e takes f4 was also possible, but then white would play rook b2. And again, white is opening up the position to black's immediate disadvantage. I don't actually see how black is able to defend her queenside in this instance. So actually this position is a bit deceptive. After b4, with the idea of rook b2 and b takes c5, white is already establishing a pretty strong position. It's also a common feature of this type of position that you could see that knight going back to c4 at an appropriate moment, really putting the heat on black's pawn structure. So c4 is played. A desperate looking move, but at least this gives black a little bit of time and momentum to get the kingside attack going. Well, Cramley's got it all covered. Bishop takes f4. E takes f4. And I wonder if you can see white's idea in this position before we go on. What is white actually going to play now? Because I think this is the most important move in the whole game coming up. Well, I wonder if you saw the move e5. I hope you did, because it's a very thematic break. A stroke. White opens up the game, and black can't resist this advance. She tried to take on e5 with her bishop, but then d6 is the logical follow-up, exposing e5. Queen comes to g7 to cover e5, but now the knight takes on b6. And it's really all a question of which is more important. Is black going to touch down on the king side first? And she's a long way from doing that. I mean, black's got to play. Let's see how many moves it takes black to get the king side attack going. g5, h5, and then g4. So 3 full moves before black can create a meaningful threat. Meanwhile, white is looking to play moves such as c4, c5, and then b5. So these queenside pawns are a winner as long as white doesn't get mated on the king side. So what we see over the next few moves is white juggling defensive responsibilities with the key idea of just pushing those pawns right down black's throat. All right, bishop e6, c4, knight c6. At last, the kingside attack cranks into action. White doesn't see any threat. She's not going to be afraid of ghosts. She just pushes those pawns. g4, we're coming to the critical moment. Queen e4, a very powerful centralising move. To an extent, calling black's bluff. What have you got to show? If there's nothing in this position, I'm just putting my pieces on perfect squares. And I'm already threatening your knight on c6. g3. Dembo knows that the game's positionally completely gone. What she's got to rely on here is checkmate. Queen takes c6. The good player does not get bluffed. They have the calculating ability to see through the position. Cramling has recognised that she can escape with the cold-blooded move, bishop c4. It's really remarkable that after queen h2 check, black doesn't have anything against the white king here. I mean, you would think with black's concentration of force on the king side, she'd be able to muster some attack. It turns out that all the tactics are working for white. Well, of course, that stems from better placed pieces. In the game, black tried bishop takes c4 check. Going back, of course, f3 is a critical move. And the idea is that after bishop takes e6 check, black goes king h8, leaving white to wonder about the threats. Well, nowadays, in this computer age, we work with computers so much that we have become accustomed to being very cold-blooded about these types of positions. Whereas in the old days, a player might panic when confronted by an attack of this kind. Computers have taught us to be a lot more cold-blooded and objective. And g takes f3, in fact, refutes black's attack. Black's only attacking with the queen and pawn. It's hardly likely that white's going to get mated here. And so it proves black and queen are pawn, but white just snaps it off, centralises the queen, and now there are no threats to speak of whatsoever for black. More than that, it's white who is actually crashing through. And the problem for black in all this is she's got no plan B. The kingside attack must succeed or it's all over. Whereas white has many plans. I mean, the overall plan is to push the queenside pawns, but here we saw white coolly refuting a kingside attack, possibly even winning with a kingside attack of her own. So going back to the game now, perhaps this all helps to explain why black took on c4 and then played f3. But of course, the problem without the white square bishop is that now black's king becomes very, very exposed, and white is able to hoover off quite a lot of pieces, leave the king exposed, and then rather elegantly dance back to h3 with the queen. And it's a remarkable position. Black hardly has any threats at all. King h8 was played. Knight e5, leaving the situation, the rather picturesque situation as it is. Black has no threats. Black takes on g2 and gets the queen out of the way. Queen takes g3. Again, very cold-blooded. Rook f5, rook e1, rook g8, queen e3. And if nothing's working for black in this position, she will never have a better chance to win the game. I mean, there's going to be d7, c6, any pawn advance you care to mention coming very soon, which will win the game. So black must be able to put white away here or it's game over.